Good morning, everybody. We are about to start. So last night after the concert, I was standing on the corner with some colleagues in the cool Minnesota night air. And it was really fun. I mean, everyone was kind of riffing on what we heard in the orchestra last night. And it was truly one of those moments that we can't ignore and take just a minute to reflect on. And, you know, I mean, there's so many things you could say about it. And I wish I had a tape recorder with my colleagues all describing all the many ways that concert was so special. But I think for me, you know, two things really stood out. One is, you know, the Sibelius Second Symphony, we've just all have heard this a million times. And it was like a brand new piece. It was like you never heard it before. And this ability to keep rediscovering our body of repertoire in the hands of such an extraordinary body of musicians led by such a wonderful conductor, I mean, just speaks worlds about the art form that we are part of and the gifts of the instrumentalists who bring it to life. And the second thing that really struck me was this uncanny amount of discipline and virtuosity that was taking place. And, you know, it's just one of those paradoxical things that it takes discipline to achieve the incredible sense of abandon that we heard. I mean, it was just so open and evocative, but you could, you know, as you listen to every little detail in the orchestra going on, it was the crafting of all of those little details that brought about this extraordinary sweeping performance. So I don't know about you, I had a ball, and I think we should just give a big round of applause to the Minnesota Orchestra. And you know, what occurs to me too is we're about to have a tough conversation and talk about some things that'll be uncomfortable for some of us. But I want to make it clear, and there should be no mistake about this, that the League is committed to making sure that orchestras like the Minnesota Orchestra and all of your orchestras continue to thrive. We want them in our world, and we want them safe and healthy. And we think in order to get there, we got to talk about some hard stuff, and that's what we're going to do. But before we do that, I have a very important thing I need to tell you. And that is that this morning's session is sponsored by DCM. And for those of you who don't know that, DCM is the premier teleservices company dedicated to supporting the sales and fundraising efforts of symphony orchestras. DCM President Phil Miller and his colleague Eric Nelson are here in Minneapolis with us. And I know you're in the room. Fellas, you want to stand up? Where are you? Okay. Thank you so much. And make sure you visit them in the exhibit hall along with all of our other wonderful business partners, which are an essential part of our coming together and moving our industry forward. Okay, so on to our program. History was made this past March 20th. In that event, a profound and positive change happened for our field and for orchestras. That was the day that the YouTube Symphony, with 101 musicians from all over the world, made a telecast on the internet that was viewed by 33 million people all over the world. And most of those 33 million people, by the way, were in North America. 3 million people listened to this and watched it on their mobile telephones. Now, the concert absolutely shattered the previous record, which, this may surprise you, but the previous record was 11 million viewers of a live stream concert, and that concert was given by U2. And for those of you who don't know who U2 is, that's a group from Ireland with Bono, and we beat them out 3-1. But as we all know, that great event alone is not sufficient to erase the sobering realities in our field today. We all love to celebrate our triumphs, but as we gather here in the Twin Cities, it's important that we also focus frankly on the state of music in America, on our industry, and how it can not only succeed but also thrive. The well-publicized reality is that there are increases in deficits, bankruptcies, and closings. I do not relish repeating, but it is important that we all recognize the harsh facts that include the average orchestra deficit in 2005 was $193,000. Just 4 years later, in 2009, that number had gone up to $697,000. In 2008, half of orchestras reported deficits. The very next year, 2009, that number had increased to over 2/3 of our member orchestras. I am the very first to acknowledge that this general downward spiral has been in the midst of the second worst economic collapse in modern world history. But many signs suggest that for orchestras, this crisis simply accelerated existing long-term trends. Detroit, Philadelphia, Syracuse, Honolulu, Mexico, and Louisville are all examples of organizations with a past history of fragility, dating well before the Great Recession of 2008. Waiting in the wings are more potentially critical situations that have not yet erupted, but they could at any time. Our current problems aren't cyclical. The recession has merely brought home and exacerbated the long-term structural problems that many orchestras have been facing for some time. The data clearly show that over the last 25 years, while orchestras were adding concerts, increasing costs, per concert attendance and sales revenue were declining each and every year. While it is not comforting, orchestras are not alone in feeling this kind of pain. We're a microcosm of what is happening all over the world. The tremendous global upheavals are leaving virtually every sector challenged to change, to adapt in order to keep up and stay ahead of the curve. And like with airlines and newspapers and healthcare, moving forward for us does not include moving backwards. I also note that not all orchestras are hurting. Our smaller budget orchestras tend to be more nimble. A very few large orchestras are weathering the near-term challenges. And our youth orchestras, though not immune, operate on an entirely different business model. But the rest, and I'm talking here about some orchestras in Group 1 extending well into Group 4, are in various stages of challenge and crisis. And on so many levels, their situation affects each and every one of us in this room. It is clear to me, and I think to most of you, that our current situation calls for urgent action, for robust innovation, and meaningful change. The first step on that path is to look candidly at our real circumstances, or as management guru Jim Collins would say, confront our brutal truths. We must start by confronting 5 key facts. So here's fact number 1. We have decreasing income and rising costs. Classical music participation has declined 29% over the past 20 years. And the arts share of all charitable giving has continued downward, now reaching its lowest level since 1998. Corporate donors, in particular, have been deserting the arts sector at a dramatic rate. During the same 20-year period, corporate philanthropy declined by 50%. Meanwhile, orchestra costs have continued to rise faster than revenues. Audiences are moving away from subscriptions, buying at the last minute and making fewer purchases per household. Our various attempts at greater community engagement have thus far only increased our costs, not our earned revenues. Fact 2, donor fatigue. National and local institutional funders and individual donors are telling us at the League that they question continued investment in orchestras. Many foundations have stopped funding orchestras because they're not seeing a return on their philanthropic investment. They are expressing frustration and doubt that the institutions can be sustained without fundamental change. Fact 3, our commitment to performance excellence is simply not enough. Quality at the highest level still matters, but striving for, even achieving world-class ranking is no guarantee of a vital and secure future. As the headlines have said it in recent weeks, none of our orchestras, theaters, or opera companies are too big or too important to fail. Fact 4, we've had a stagnant product delivery system. The YouTube Symphony experience proves there's enormous appetite for our music, but our musicians and managers and conductors are not moving fast enough to meet the public demand for new forms of the orchestral experience. Meanwhile, most collective bargaining agreements reflect this failure. They should promote innovation rather than discourage it. Fact 5, lack of diversity and broad-based support. Orchestras, as large, community-supported nonprofit institutions, continue to maintain workforces that are 98% white, and audiences that also generally lack diversity despite our efforts to broaden representation. Yet by 2020, that's 9 years from now, the United States population will be 55% non-white. Collectively, these are daunting concerns. My job, our job at the League, is not only to help face up to these challenges, but to find creative ways to effectively address these and other challenging realities so we can overcome the obstacles and focus on creativity and on innovation to move from frailty to vitality and to understand the status quo is far more scary than change is. Andy Warhol, of all people, put this very well when he said, "They always say time changes things, but you actually have to change them yourself." As I noted earlier, this counteroffensive begins with candor. And I want to take us back to an experience that's it's just emblazoned in my mind. When we were doing our strategic planning, we had a meeting to share an early draft of our plan, and the draft referred to the fact that there were declining audiences. And we were meeting with a group of large budget orchestras, and they said, you really can't say that. And they said, it's not that it's not true, but you just can't say that out loud. So, well, we did. We put it in our plan, and we put appropriate context around it so that, we were not the only ones dealing with this problem. But nonetheless, we said it, and it was a very important thing to do. And when credible new data came out in 2009, it was documenting the audience challenges that we were facing, the League made sure that everybody in our field knew about it, understood it, but the very most important thing was that we made sure people were prepared to take action about it. We're not in the business of serving up bad news. We're in the business of serving up the world as we understand it, and then as a threshold to moving forward. And so what happened? So many of us began to address the findings, and 2 years later, nobody in orchestras was denying that we had serious audience challenges, and accompanying this new recognition was not only an unprecedented amount of testing and new approaches to audience development, but also some significant successes. So if there is a lesson to be learned here, It is that acknowledging the problem is an essential precursor to innovation. I'm going to stop and have a little sip of water. This is a long speech. But it's going to get better. So, I want to talk about three things that I think orchestra leadership teams, managers, boards, and musicians must do that can help crash-proof their orchestras. First, understand and take responsibility for your orchestra's true financial condition. Working to balance the budget, as hard as that is, and I know how hard that is, but you know what? It's not enough. Our boards and executive leaders must acknowledge that weak and fragile infrastructure is crippling our orchestra's ability to deliver on their missions. When all of our energy is consumed by eliminating deficits and creating short-term fixes, it can be daunting to innovate and to change. Trustees must understand not just their operating budgets, but all of the capitalization requirements. And we'll soon hear more about that from Susan Nelson. They must be transparent, and they have to ensure that all stakeholders understand the numbers and even then the implications of those numbers. And the board must take responsibility for supporting management in making the often painful decisions that lead to financial health on both the cost and the revenue side. Naturally, collective bargaining plays a big role here. While there's been a lot of blame directed at one side or another, let us remember that the goal of bargaining is to reach a durable, a lasting agreement. It is the board's responsibility to stop short of agreeing to terms it cannot afford. And while it is appropriate and expected that musicians will seek to gain as much as they can, it is not reasonable to push boards to accept terms that the organization simply cannot support. Governance continuity is key because our boards need to be able to focus as much on the future as on the near-term financial position. So it's critical that board chairs stay in place for longer than the 1 or 2 years terms that are typical in our field. I'm taking on the term limit debate because we have a shared and long-term responsibility to these orchestras we love that goes well beyond the limits of any one of our individual terms. Second priority, realign with community needs. Many today are experiencing a very understandable tension between our long and successful tradition and commitment to excellence and quality, and an increasing need to serve a wider cross-section of our communities. And while community work may not translate directly into higher earned income, sustaining and growing it has never been more important. As funders and governments make tough choices about how to allocate scarce resources and challenge the public value that orchestras create. As our colleague Bruce Kopic succinctly put it, telling the community how important and famous you are is very different than inspiring the community to support you because of how invaluable you are. In the new issue of Symphony Magazine, Milwaukee Symphony principal violist Robert Levine goes so far as to write, getting community engagement right will involve rethinking themselves from top to bottom as cultural service agencies rather than high-end performance companies. This is a huge change, but you know what? It's actually already beginning to happen in our field. The Bay Atlantic Symphony, the Cleveland Orchestra, Elgin, Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, Longwood Symphony, Reno Chamber Orchestra, Utah, these are all partnering with healthcare organizations to offer programs and experiences that promote healing through music. Figuring out how to bridge excellence in cultural service is complicated and time-consuming work. And that is why I would not recommend starting the conversation at the bargaining table. Instead, Start with understanding the unique assets of the musicians in your own orchestra and the unique needs of your community, and these will be different in every case. The third priority is about fostering creativity. If we're to be a creative form and not just a recreative one, then we must work to attract creative people into our organizations as well as nurture the gifts of the artists that are already in our orchestras. We need to be asking, what kind of talent must we include to create the musical experiences that will usher in the next generation of people who passionately want us in their lives? Young entrepreneurial musicians, some of them in our orchestras, are finding a following with audiences and funders by performing in small and often unlikely venues. They may cross genre boundaries or simply rethink their approaches to traditional repertoire, but they thrive on intimacy and audience engagement. If we want, and I think we do, the next generation of creative artists involved with our orchestras, our current audition system will need to change to embrace a broader range of talents than just superb musicianship and technique. We can all take a page out of the Collegiate Performing Arts Playbook. At Stanford, the University of North Carolina, and Dartmouth, to name just a few, the concert series there are tightly woven into contemporary campus-wide themes, established in the humanities and in the science curricula. Among these, tolerance, the class system in America, capital punishment, all things that consume people in America. These are things we think about and we care about. And surely our repertoire, our current repertoire, and the work still to be written deserve a place at this exciting and emerging table. Later this afternoon, we're going to hear from Stanley Romenstein, who will talk about an emerging new project in Atlanta, a partnership between the Symphony and Emory University on the theme of creation. There will be 3 new works commissioned on the creation, and the curricula at Emory will focus in the humanities, sciences, and arts, all on creation, and citywide forums to explore this fundamental theme of human life, bringing the orchestra directly into the mainstream of what people are thinking and feeling. 4 orchestras, the Pacific Symphony, Buffalo Philharmonic, North Carolina, Louisville Orchestra, they've created a multi-year collaboration to integrate humanities themes with their performances. The project has just been awarded a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, an encouraging reminder that money does follow vision. And what greater display of vision in our field than the recent Spring for Music Festival. 7 orchestras, big and small, one after the other, offering original programs, every seat in Carnegie Hall priced at $25. There was only 1 blockbuster in all 7 concerts and only 1 piece written before the 20th century. And people came, and lots of them came, and they loved it. It was really a proud moment for our field. So, strengthening fiscal planning and infrastructure, realigning with community needs, fostering creativity. These are 3 big but necessary tasks, and they cannot be accomplished without everyone's participation. In the same symphony article I mentioned earlier, Robert Levine also points out that orchestras are not and should not be run primarily for the benefit of musicians, but musicians benefit the most from orchestras succeeding. He says of the changing climate, musicians' only chance to have that change not be to their detriment is to actively participate in designing the changes. And he encourages them not to wait until the orchestra is already in trouble, because that is too late. During my visits with orchestras across the country, I've been privileged to see many instances where musicians and managers work together with mutual respect to solve tough problems. Rather than pointing fingers at one another, we owe it to our audiences and supporters to try to better understand each other's positions and develop a path forward before reaching the bargaining table. Failure to do so only creates lose-lose scenarios that none of us can afford. This is not an easy time to be working in our field. I want to acknowledge that everyone in this room is on a journey that is demanding tremendous courage and tremendous sacrifice. Our musicians have taken this period very, very hard. Our board members have had to stretch even further than they knew they could stretch. Our staffs, in many cases, have been shrunk. We have few people on the job, and this is a really, really tough time. But my comments today are not intended to single out anyone, but rather to remind us that we are at a crossroads as a field, and we all have a critical choice to make. Will we seize this moment to creatively build a strong future, or will we continue to cling to a status quo, envisioning the road ahead as though through a rearview mirror? As we answer that question, we must be honest and not let ourselves off the hook. Nothing less than the future of our field is at stake, and there is no time to waste. I hope you all agree that now is the time to embrace change and innovation and create a vibrant future for orchestral music. The League is here to help. We are keeping these priorities at the forefront of all that we say and all that we do. I pledge that we will work with you in every way we can to support your individual goals, and together we will achieve our shared vision for America's orchestras. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, as I said, these issues are in the forefront of our thinking at the League, and we're going to start right now to dig in to two of the big areas that I referenced in my speech. One having to do with our financial health, and the other having to do with our communities and our markets and how we fit there. And we're going to hear first from Susan Nelson. She is the principal of TDC, and she's going to tell us about the findings from her study on the capitalization of Philadelphia's arts community. And following Susan, we're going to take a brief stretch break, and then we're going to hear from Steve Wolff, on his findings from the Columbus Arts, his study of the sustainability of the Columbus arts market. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Susan Nelson.
Good morning. Thank you, Jesse, very much. I hope to be as inspiring talking about financial health as Jesse was about the future of the orchestras. Can we start the slideshow? Yeah, great. So today we're going to talk about two different areas. First, we did a study in Philadelphia, as Jesse has referred to, looking at the capitalization of 150 organizations. And we're going to talk to you a little bit about what we learned. Then we're going to talk to you about how capitalization can work for you and how to develop a strategy about how to capitalize your organizations based on all the lessons we learned. Okay, so first, the study. We worked with the Pew Charitable Trusts in Philadelphia and the William Penn Foundation, and they asked us to look at 150 of their organizations over time. They were worried because after investing in financial health, long-term planning, financial TA, new program development, a whole host of things that they hoped would strengthen the organizations, they didn't think they were in good financial health. In fact, some of them they thought were worse. So they wanted to know why, what was happening. So we looked at 150 of the organizations, and we interviewed 60 of them individually to really learn what they thought about was going on in their own organizations. And we asked them these three questions. Are you capitalized to achieve your mission? Do your leaders understand the relationship between capitalization and mission? Is that evident in your actions? Can you see what's happening in everyday work by the long-term capitalization of your organization? And is the system helping or hurting in helping you capitalize your organization? So first we had to start with saying, what is capitalization? What does that mean? And really what that is the accumulation of your assets over time that you can apply to your mission. What are the dollars that you have that you've accumulated over all the history of your organization that you can apply? What resources do you have? Everybody needs three kinds of baseline capitalization. Everybody needs some working capital, everybody needs some reserves, and everybody needs some risk capital, the money that you need to start new projects, to start new ideas, to test things. Some people need endowment because they have a long-term view of where they belong in the community and they need that stabilization. And some people need plant reserves because they have a building, and that building costs real money. So how would we know capitalization when we saw it? We would look for these things in people's balance sheets. And why did we care? Why did the funders care that we used this lens to look? We believe that poor capitalization is a risk to your mission. What we've been talking about for a long time in the performing arts world is the following. We're worried about not making payroll. We're worrying about collection calls. We're worried about credit lines. We're worried about the fact that maybe we're overspending our endowment or we can't fix the roof. We're worried that, we don't seem to be able to do those things. We spend a lot of time talking about those things, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about what's really underlying that problem. What's underlying that problem when you can't pay your bills or you don't have enough cash is that you can't attract the talent or the artists or the people you need to do the work of the mission. It's your mission that's at risk. You can't create the innovative products, the new things that you need to do in real time to do it. You cannot find sustainability. So while we talk about the symptoms, what we're worried about is the mission risk. We're worried that you can't do the very thing that you were created to do. And that's why this lens was important. So, what did we find? We found that over 75% of the groups we looked at, 150 groups in over a 3-year time period, pre-recession, had highly constrained capital structures. And those who were in a capital campaign to expand were the weakest of all. So the people who were least prepared to expand, had the worst balance sheets, were the ones in capital campaigns. It's a little scary. On average, we found that people only had working capital. We devised a series of ratios. If you read our big report we did, in the back, there's this 2-page analysis of all these ratios we did. We can test this, we can test that, we can look at these ratios, that ratios. We used one. Because there was only working capital. Nobody else had any money. And on average, working capital was a week of operations. It didn't matter if you were big or small. It didn't matter what discipline you were in. It was uniformly bad. What is most upsetting is that the largest institutions were actually the worst. There was no shelter in being large, and in fact, the needs were deeper. So, this was a wake-up call for the funders in Philadelphia. These original findings shocked people. In fact, we created scores for all these organizations. We did not publish those scores because people were too afraid to look at the numbers in a public. To talk to Jesse's point about being honest, people didn't want to be that honest. So we talked about it in general. So what we got to was most people were not well capitalized. Here's the second thing we really talked about. There was an assumption that the reason that people are not well capitalized is because organizational leadership doesn't know that it needs to be. Funders entered the game, consultants entered the game thinking, that's what it is. You just don't know. That's actually not true. In our 60 interviews, 58 people could completely explain their financial condition. They knew exactly where they were. They could tell us in great detail the pain they were experiencing. They could tell us how they were experiencing it. They could tell us how many days of cash they had. They could tell us why they were overspending on the endowment. They could tell us why their capital campaigns were not going to fix their actual problems. And the people who were in these capital campaigns who were in great distress could come right out and say, this capital campaign is going to make my situation worse. I know it. So it's not about knowledge. People know. You all know. Every single one of you, I'm about to tell you about how to read a balance sheet. You might not know the fancy parts of balance sheets. Every one of you know what your cash condition is. What we learned was there are no incentives in the system to talk about this. People can talk about the poor, corrosive effects of it, but they have no venue to talk about it. They feel powerless to talk about it. Who would I talk about it to? Can I talk about it with my board? They don't want to hear it. They just want me to break even. Can I talk about it with my funders? They just want me to hit my campaign goal. If I talk about this, it's not going to feel good. So it wasn't knowledge. It was definitely something about the system. So we dug deeper, and we said, really, what are all the pieces that are happening here? And here's what we learned. In Philadelphia, there is a great mandate that all foundations have to make sure that everybody has a 3-year rolling strategic plan. So lack of planning can't be part of the issue. That's what we thought when we started. Everybody has to have a plan. You can't get funding without a plan. You can't be in our sample without a plan. So maybe planning doesn't help. But when we really dug in, and what we learned is a lot of the planning was internally focused, and we'll talk to you in a minute about what that means. Then we also learned that technical assistance abounded. Everybody had it. Everybody in our sample set had it, and had lots of it. Maybe that doesn't work. Because maybe it does, in that everybody has knowledge, but nobody could do anything about it. So why is that happening? And then, as I alluded to before, the incentives were really completely misaligned between funders and the larger goals of capitalization. People who were giving the very money, goals for what they were trying to accomplish, were not actually aligned with capitalization, even though that's what they wanted to talk about. So let's talk about each of those. Okay, planning was not contextualized. So everybody had them, but they were a lot of internal conversations about what they wanted to do, untested by market realities. And if there were tests of market realities, they were benchmarks. So Jesse's going to talk about term limits. I'm going to talk about benchmarking. Benchmarking offers false information. It does not allow you to live in your community looking at your data, looking at your audiences, looking at what your community can do or wants to do with you as you move forward. It tells you about other people's communities. Not helpful. You have to live in your own community. You have to understand your own data. So when we did see data, it was about benchmarking. And the other thing I would say about benchmarking, the first thing I teach my associates when they come out of MBA school, and they come in, they have all these little benchmarks they want to show me about how something should work. I always say, so did you pull the financials on those benchmarks? Did you look and see if they were actually financially healthy? Did you look and see if they had impact? Did they have higher audiences? Did they have better numbers? What are you benchmarking? Are you benchmarking the average, the lowest common denominator, or success? So benchmarks are not helpful. That's number one. Number two is many people had created projections based on what they wanted to happen, what they wanted to aim for, rather than what they could do. And that was problematic for many people. And they told us, we don't know how to ground our projections in reality. We haven't tested real price, real cost, real investment strategies. There wasn't a real thinking about how we would do that. So planning was not fully contextualized. It was extant, but it hadn't really worked. Financial TA was not integrated. This was a nice wake-up call for people like me. In fact, I actually have lived this. You go into an organization and you tell them, you have a terrible balance sheet, you're out of cash. And as many people I interviewed said, so yeah, I know that, now what? Now what? Financial TA given to organizations, and many of these people had it, many of you have probably gotten it this way, unattached to your strategy, unattached to what you're trying to do, standing alone, gives you nothing to do. It gives you no way to act. So what we found is, of the 60 people who had financial TA, 2 had done anything with it. Everybody else put it away because it was not integrated back into what they were trying to accomplish. So having financial TA alone, this was very revelatory to funders. We made them really think what they're investing in. But here's the part that funders own, and they own it big. Most incentives that funders give us are geared towards break-even budgets and isolated projects. Neither of these have the long-term thinking that's required for organizations to thrive and be well capitalized. Organizations get project grants that don't pay for everything, don't drop to the bottom line, don't do anything to advance the mission, sometimes pull you off mission, taking up what few resources you have away. And the reward in the system is for break even. You're good, you broke even. No one asked you for anything else. One of the things these 2 funders understood is that they held people accountable for break even, but they did not hold them accountable for surpluses. People do what they're held accountable for. It's hard enough to do that. As Jesse has just told you, it's hard enough to break even. So not being held accountable for something greater was really hard. This was a huge lesson to the group we were working with. And a little later on, I'll tell you, it was a huge lesson when we took it to a wider group of funders at Grant Makers in the Arts, who had very revelatory moments when we said, it's your investment behavior that's creating the very situation that you don't want. So here's the other part of that conversation. Universally, in our interviews we've heard, and in my practice I've heard, I can't tell people the truth. I can't tell funders what I really need, because if I do, I will look weak, unrealistic, unfundable. So I'm not going to tell you. And at some level, managers have the same conversation with their boards. I'm not going to say what it really costs. They don't want to hear it. So we have created a whole set of systems that while we say financial sustainability is what we want and what we need, boards say it, funders say it, we say it, but we don't have any way to talk about it and align those incentives. So this puts organizations in a double bind. I put this quote from a person who runs a theater in Philadelphia above my desk, and I think about it all the time. I feel as if the art world is at a critical moment where we need to take some real risks. Yet somehow there is an overall feeling that art groups need to be financially conservative. There is not much reward to taking risks unless you succeed every time, which of course is not the nature of risk. And yet many funders want you to succeed all the time. They want their money to make sure that it was perfect, that it worked out, and that's not how this is all going to play out, and that's not what capitalization is about. So we talked about that. So in the end, what we came to with the group of funders who sponsored this study was this. It's all about risk. How do we manage risk? How do we talk about risk? How do we have the money to ameliorate the risks of economic downturns and changing environments? And how do we have the money to take the risk that we need to take to invest in our art, invest in our audiences, respond to external forces? And what happens if you can't? So this is where we left them. It was a really sobering moment, talk about sobering moments for folks in Philadelphia. There were lots of conversations about this, about how we could change behavior and think about doing different things. And one of the things they asked us was, well, how would you help organizations achieve a capitalization strategy? what would you do? How would it work? How would you get a different set of conversations going amongst people? So, that's what we're going to talk about. Again, capitalization lives and is monitored in these buckets that we've been talking about. Working capital, operating reserves, risk capital, endowment, and plant reserves. But I would remind you as we go through this, there's another piece of capital that you all represent, and that's human capital. And what the performing arts world has been doing really well over the last 20 years is bootstrapping on human capital and ignoring this capital. And so all the success that you have done has come on the cost of human capital. And I would argue that it can only take you so far in a changing environment. And so the human capital is rich. It's sitting in this room. What's poor in the sector is this kind of capital. Okay. So here's where we start. How well are you capitalized now? When I go into an organization, I never look at P&Ls. It takes me a long time to get that far. I look at the balance sheet. It's your permanent record. That one that you were all worried that you were carrying around, you are. It's the permanent record that shows all the history of your organization. It shows you your accumulated financial performance over time. It shows you how strong you are to face the future. It tells you how much cash you have to pay your bills. That's where we look. We start there. Then what we do is we say, okay, sitting in the balance sheet, what have you really got? Your P&L, your net income, drives to your net assets. If you make money, your net assets increase. If you lose money, your net assets decrease. Really pretty simple. But what's in those net assets? And here's where we fool around a lot with what we say we have. These pots of money are actually in order of reality. The top, operating working capital and operating reserves, that's the money you need every day to get going and make the day happen. If you have money in what you're calling plant reserves or restricted dollars, and you have no working capital or operating reserve, you don't have any plant reserve or risk capital because you've got to pay the bills. You can't double count the money. And what most people do is they double count the money. They say we have $1 million of X unrestricted, and it's all these things. It's a dessert topping, it's a floor wax. It's not. Each bucket has to represent its own bucket of money. And the first buckets of money are working capital and operating reserves. Because when you run out of money, it sucks everything else dry and takes it all down with you. So that's the first thing. The other thing that we have to think about is how we think about of endowment. Because there's restricted endowment and unrestricted endowment. And again, we're looking for cash coverage and receivable coverage on these pieces. Do you really have it? So we want to start with everybody having honest conversations about what's in each of these buckets. Can you tie it to your balance sheet? Can you show the cash for each of them? Do you really have it? And that's where we start. Then people want us to tell us right away, okay, we've done that. Now we have our buckets. How much should be in the bucket? And here's where you all want me to say 10% here, 3% here, 2 months here, 4 months there, and we can go home. That's not how it works. There are absolutely no cookie-cutter answers. Each of your capitalization strategies is going to look slightly different. What needs to be in each of these buckets needs to reflect your reality, needs to talk about what you need to do. There is no one right number. So your strategy determines the kind of funds that it requires. And in order to do that, we have to look at your mission, your values, your program. What are your core business model drivers? What is your time horizon and life cycle? What's your marketplace? Where do you live? Only then can we figure out what are the necessary buckets of funds you need and where you're going to get them. So, oops, over advanced. Okay, mission and vision. This is starting to look like strategic planning, isn't it? That's because it is. This is strategic planning. They are not separate things. So you need to start here. And I put this slide up because it seems like, of course, we would start here with our mission and vision, but I would push you to really think about this. Revisiting the core of what your mission and vision is, whether it's being inspired, what Jesse said this morning, or inspired by the very conversations you're all having, is critical. What are you trying to do and for whom? Answering that question matters most. And having everybody in your organization agree, critical. Where are we going? How are we getting there? Why does it matter? Then we can start to think about other things. The next group of things we can think about are, what are your business model drivers? While every business has a multiplicity of drivers that are, again, unique to their own business, at the core, we would argue everybody has these drivers. Your audience, a facility if you have one, high fixed costs if you do. How you think about your capitalization depends on the mix that you have. So, if you have only one major driver, like audience, then you have a lot of flexibility in how you approach the world. And you have a lower need for capital. The more drivers you add, the higher need for capital and the less amount of flexibility you have around these issues. So you have to think about that. How much flexibility do I really have in my system? Then we have to think about your time horizon. I would say that when I've done this presentation before, this has been the hardest concept or most controversial concept that we have put out there. We believe organizations have 3 basic time horizons. One is more the immediate or individual view. We would say that's an organization who really represents an individual artistic point of view. It could be a sole artistic point of view, but it's small, it's nimble. It may be here for 20 years, but it thinks in 1 or 2 or 3 year cycles. It has very little surrounding fixed costs. It's really about an individual's point of view. It happens usually to have a small budget. It doesn't always work that way, but budget usually correlates that way. Medium-term organizations are what we call brand-identified organizations. I know what that organization is by its name. And its artistic direction can change, but that artistic direction is being hired to that brand. I know what that is. Blah, 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 Baroque. I know what that is. And so those organizations probably have 30, 40-year time horizons. They have some level of fixed costs. They may or may not need a facility. They're in the middle. They have a lot of the characteristics of long organizations, and their budgets tend to be anywhere from maybe $1.5 million to maybe $15, $20 million. Majority of organizations we think live in there. Then there are long-term view organizations. And these are organizations either because of their civic place or their need to steward assets in the larger arts world. These would be probably a lot of museums would be in this bucket, who really have what we ask as a 100-year vision. When I work with organizations, I always ask them, what is your long-term vision? And if you can say, I have a 100-year vision, then we think of you as this. So again, flexibility and capital intensity are living on this spectrum. If you're sitting in an individual view organization with a lot more flexibility, your capital intensity is much less. Your risk for not having large buckets of capital, much less. You're much more nimble. You can respond much more quickly to what's happening. You can be innovative faster and quicker. You can change what you're doing quicker. The longer term your time horizon is, the more you need money, the more you need capital. We checked in on some of the 150 organizations we looked at pre-recession to say, how are people doing post-recession? While size and shape didn't matter pre-recession about where we were, post-recession, little, small, nimble organizations are doing far better than medium-term, long-term organizations. Because when the lack of capital happened during the recession, medium-term and long-term organizations didn't have the capital and couldn't respond fast enough. So their cuts were deeper, their percentage of shrinking was deeper, the hurt was deeper. Smaller organizations, even though they didn't have as much capital, there wasn't as much to risk. They were able to do it much faster. The other thing I would say is, sometimes when people look at this chart, they think of it as an aspirational chart. I know, we'll start out with the individual view and we'll get to the long-term view. This is not an aspirational chart. This is about knowing who you are. The next piece we need to think about is life cycle. One of the things that's really critical is in the need for capital is where are you in your life cycle? If you're starting up, growing, declining or renewing, in any of these critical moments of inflection, the simplest way I can say this is you need huge pots of cash. So it's antithetical to think we're going to shrink and get better without huge pots of cash. Shrinking defines the amount of cash you need, but doesn't take away the need for huge pots of cash. So you have to think, am I in one of these moments of inflection in my organization? If so, I need some cash. Okay, so here's the importance of the marketplace. A thorough understanding tests your mission and makes you go back and say, can I accomplish it? And it really is definition of audience, demand pricing, support, and competition. Here's two facts that I think are important for people to think about as you go through this marketplace. In the 60s, the US Census determined what was the average household spend as a percentage of household budget, on entertainment. That percentage has not changed since 1964. Yet, the definition of what's in entertainment, the bucket that is called entertainment, has increased fivefold. So people are not spending any more money, but their choices are fivefold greater. And what we also know is during that same period of time, nonprofit offerings in mature marketplaces across the country have increased threefold. And they have outpaced population growth in mature cities. So you need to understand that people have more choices on a per capita basis than they've ever had before. Understanding in your own marketplace what those choices are, as opposed to what the national choices are, what the price points are, what the offerings are, what the niches are, critical. You have to understand your own lens. And we really do think that that speaks to the funding environment as well when we talk about audiences, as well as we think about it as the actual audience itself. We have the privilege of going around to a lot of different cities. Every funding ecology is different. Some places are driven by foundations, some places are driven by individual donors, some people are driven by corporations, some it's a mix, sometimes government takes the lead. Understanding your own ecology is really critical here. That's interesting, okay. The other piece that you need to think about is what are the resources it's going to take? What is the cost of really doing business? You know, really on a local basis, what should talent, the fixed costs, and marketing and development investments be, given what you've learned about the marketplace? And for those with buildings, you have to really think about how does that all come together to fund your long-term requirement of buildings. Okay, so now you have all these pieces. We talked to you about lack of contextualized planning. Here's what we've been really thinking about. Standard strategic planning kind of looks like these buttons floating around on the screen. People are really good about talking about mission and artistic vision. People are getting better and smarter all the time about strategy. The market is something that people do talk about, but it's often a discussion about we want the market to behave like this, as opposed to this is how the market behaves. And there's some talk about rolling 3-year budgets, and you should have a budget that goes with this. It should look like, and it should break even. And then over in the corner, if we're doing a capital campaign, we talk about capitalization when we get to the capital campaign. We argue that, and this is a chart only a consultant can really love. But we think that this all needs to be integrated and holistic. You need to look at your time horizon, your business drivers, where you are in your life cycle. You need to lay that over your mission and vision, where you stand in the market, what are the resources you need. Look at all that data and come up with an integrated strategy that looks at your programmatic approach, your organizational approach, and your capitalization strategy. It's integrated. Talking about money and strategy separately only happens in the nonprofit world. Microsoft would never think about that. Nobody who innovates would think about that. People who innovate build money. They build real money. The risk capital in this sector comes in the most horrifying way. Risk capital comes in grants because we haven't built it. So the way you all get risk capital is you go out and get a grant. Here's what happens. A bunch of smart people get in the room. You've done this. You've looked at your market. You've had really interesting thoughts. You're really smart. You actually know what to do. You have a great idea. So what do? You write a grant. A year and a half later, you try to implement it. The market moved. The reason you failed was probably you didn't get enough money, but you also had the market move on you. And you've not new lessons. The risk capital strategies are all unaligned. So you are behind the 8 ball the moment you start. Risk capital that comes a year and a half later is too late. It's too late. And so when you don't have your own money to risk and think and pilot and test and then maybe go get larger investment dollars, you've really created a situation that doesn't allow you to do the very thing you all want to do. So, now we get to the part about size. So, in every case here, what we say is when you look at what you need, first you size the need against everything we just talked about. So for operating and working capital and your reserves, you look at your fixed costs and your fixed cost of talent and the predictability of your actual revenue streams, and you figure out the delta. This money should come from surpluses in your budget. You need to feed your own working capital and operating reserves dollars. That needs to happen over time. This doesn't happen overnight, but this money needs to come from you. You need to generate surpluses. You need to figure out how your budget can do that. Risk capital happens when you look at how do you think about innovation? How important is innovation? What would a pilot program look like? At any given time, how much money should I have in my balance sheet that I could actually apply to something that I may not be able to pay myself back on right away? How would I do that? How could I have enough money in my balance sheet that it would be okay to do that? Well, you couldn't have it if you hadn't had the first ones already put away. Same thing with plant reserve. Those dollars, too, should start to come from your own operations. But we all know you're starting from a tough place. So you need to have conversations with the people who fund you about seeding some of these dollars. How do we get these dollars in there? And then endowment really is about what your business model is and what kind of endowment you really need. And that really, of course, does necessitate long-term fundraising and how you would think about it. So that's how you think about getting all these dollars put together. So you can do this. As I said to you in the very beginning, the smartest people I know in the arts are the people who run the arts organizations. They actually, everything I've just told you, I'm sure you know. But it's about making a commitment to actually thinking about it and how to do it. There are tools to do it. There are lots of folks who can help. But people like me, we can only help you to a point. This is really about what do you want to do? What commitments do you want to make? You're in the driver's seat. Your capitalization strategy should follow your strategy. This is about taking ownership of your own numbers. And the process really matters. Gathering data and making strategic decisions needs to be a very inclusive process. It requires the full engagement of the board up front. People I know who have actually thought about long-term capitalization in their organizations and have changed their capital structure to support their mission and to support their long-term goals have made this a commitment of the entire organization. It has been discussed ad infinitum at the board, and it is part of the board monitoring process now. It's part of what the board asks of leadership. How are we doing on these things? Where are these dollars coming from? What do we care about? And it's also all throughout the organization strategy as well. The whole organization needs to understand why these dollars matter. If you are trying to think about how to create an organization that creates surpluses, and you are realigning your organization to do that, there will be decisions you make that staff will not understand unless you can talk about why you're trying to get here and why this really matters. So you really have to get everybody committed. And as you all know, strategy can only be executed effectively if everybody's working together. Here's the next tricky piece. External support is essential. The best strategy in the world doesn't have the support of your funders and donors and audiences, doesn't matter. So, getting people on board with how you're thinking about capitalizing your organization and how it fits with your strategy key. As I said to you earlier, we are living in the land of misaligned incentives. And we are complicit in that conversation. We do not tell people what we need. We do not force the issue. We do not make it understood. If you want great impacts and great outcomes, they cost money. On the flip side, we have to be ready to hear that what your idea is or what you want to do is not worthy of getting money. This is a two-way conversation. But it has to change, and you have to take responsibility for for starting that conversation. And planning is a great way to do it. Because there is a real chance that external people won't understand. We have given some version of this talk to many funders around the country. There are still funders who believe that if you have a surplus, you don't need support. And we understand that that's somehow a conversation that needs to change, and that people need to have that conversation in a really direct way, that in fact organizations that are delivering high quality and a surplus are most worthy of support. And so that conversation is something that funders are starting to have with themselves. They want to see that that is something that makes sense to them. And we've been able to say, if we can show organizations can invest in themselves, they can do better, their missions are less at risk, they're going to do the thing you want, which is produce the art that you want to invest in, they're starting to see that perhaps that's a good way to go. But there are a whole level of very sophisticated funders across the country who I would tell you are engaging in the much more sophisticated conversation, which is we have been investing in the arts for 20, 30 years, and our outcomes are not good. We're not happy. How can we change it? And they are taking ownership for changing the conversation, and they do realize that they've been part of the problem. And so they are looking to have this conversation with you. And so I would encourage you to find national funders who are talking about this and thinking about this and have them support your efforts. There are things that are happening right now in the world of funding that can make you really help you think about this. So I encourage you to all think about this capitalization idea. There has never been a moment of greater inflection in the last 30 years in the arts than there is right now. Generational shift, change in the way we operate, all the things Jesse just talked about you. And it's going to take all the talent, leadership, the ability to risk, and capital to accomplish that change. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the time.
Well, we had promised you a 2-minute break to absorb everything that Susan has just talked about. But time is moving forward, and so you're going to have to be processing all of that from the time it takes me to leave this podium and for Steve Wolff to come up here and tell you about what he's learned about the sustainability of the arts organizations in the Columbus market. Steve, come on up.
Thanks, everybody. Please feel free to stretch and get up a little bit, shake yourself out. It's early in the morning for some. I spent about a week preparing not what I was going to say to you, but looking for a good musician joke. I couldn't come up with one, but I need some help. Does anybody know where the Control, Alternate, Delete button is on an iPad? I have an Apple logo. It's very nice. I have nothing else. So we'll resort to old technology. I need, Susan, from you, the clicker. Yeah, I did. Doesn't want to do that for us. You want to work on it for me? Oh, look at that. Whatever you just said, it took care of it. You did it. You talked to it. We're there. We're there. We're still going to go with the old technology because despite where we are, I'm not sure that we're quite there. Anyway, what I want to do today is try to tie together what Jesse and what Susan told you. Are you on my wireless? Can I move around? I hate podiums. Now we are. There we go. What I want to do is try together what Jesse and Susan shared with you with one community's story. If we can go to the slides, maybe. Just keep vamping. So I'm walking slow. This is a good opportunity for you all to stretch some more. What I want to tell you is the story of how Columbus is addressing many of the challenges that Jesse and that Susan talked about how do we know what's the right size for our community? What are the investments that we should make? How do we grapple with issues of community planning, cultural planning, and successful result? Am I going to have to come back there? You all have paper, right? So let's go ahead. Take a look at your page. First thing I want to do is I want to thank the Columbus Foundation. The Columbus Foundation, like many other community foundations, is actually different than I think most arts funders are. They're thoughtful people, and I think they think ahead of the curve. They're very, very proactive people, and the thing that I think they know best is that you have to bring all of the players to the table. It can't be just the folks inside of the circle. And the Columbus Foundation's been investing not just financial capital in the arts sector for quite a long time, but leadership capital in the arts sector for a long time. That's Susan's presentation. It's a very good presentation. We can see if I can give Susan's presentation. You do the rehearsal, right? Anybody ever been here before? Anyway, as he's working his way to that presentation, we'll just go on. We all know that the sector is stressed. Jesse quoted some facts. Susan quoted some facts. The NEA tells us that arts participation, can I come down here too, as long as that doesn't work? We'll have a little more fun. Can you still see me in the back? Yeah, okay. The NEA tells us that arts participation is, oh, there we go. Very nice, thank you. That participation is down 30% in the past 2 decades, but that's only by the definition of 8 traditional, not-for-profit arts disciplines. Susan mentioned a 3-fold increase in what's available to us in that period of time. Jesse mentioned that arts giving has declined. Giving USA says, that the arts, as a percentage, it's actually been 7th out of 10 for a very long time. And TCG did a really interesting study that said that even if you're a theater company and you're spending the same amount of money that you used to spend, you're purchasing 29% less in the last decade. The orchestra field isn't any different. In the orchestra field, there are real declines in aggregate paid attendance. And it hasn't been offset by increases in ticket prices. I had a wonderful time working with the league staff, crunching data yet 4 or 5 or 10 more ways than it's been crunched. And we couldn't find a solution. Expenses have increased ahead of inflation by 25% in just 10 years. And while there have been real gains in contributed income, 18%, our donors themselves can't solve the problem. They're falling behind the gap. The curves just don't line up. So Columbus, like so many other communities, decided it was time to actually ask the hard question. They said, is the breadth and depth of the cultural ecosystem in aggregate in our community appropriate to the size, the composition, and the resources in our community? Talk about a question that doesn't often get asked. They went even farther, and they said, are individual organizations within this system able to sustain themselves given the composition, resources, and size of our community. Now, I'm sure you all know the Columbus Symphony story, and that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is a community story, and the data that it used, the knowledge that it applied, and the solutions that it's seeking. Lots of studies, lots and lots of studies in Columbus, 7, I think. There was a creative economy study, a cultural blueprint study, the Creative Columbus study. Then there was a report on the future of the arts in Columbus. That was done by a university. It was a very, very seminal piece of work. Then we moved on to the Columbus 2020 report, our work, which was the Columbus Arts Market Sustainability Study, and a review of the Greater Columbus Arts Council. So there was no shortage of knowledge, as Susan suggested to us. What there was a lack of understanding. Everybody said, it's the economy, stupid. Well, guess what? It wasn't the economy, stupid. I love Susan's work because they went back, as many of us are starting to, pre-economic recession, to discover that, in fact, the problems are structural, that they predated the constraint that we've been under. So what were the problems that we learned about in Columbus? Boy, Jesse mentioned this one. I should have never shared my slides with him. Arts crisis fatigue. People are so tired. Columbus, they had Trilogy in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. Then they had the National Arts Stabilization Effort in the middle 90s. Now they have Thrive at 5. And what we heard from leader after leader, political leader, arts leader, business leader, educator, was those are bridges to nowhere. Everybody always has an idea how to solve the problem, but they actually don't know what the problem is. We heard, as Jesse said, that people are really unwilling to tickle the pink elephant, that they're really not ready to redefine the usual. Yes, we're constrained. Got a lot of money invested in theaters, concert halls, galleries, museums. It's pretty hard to sort of turn your back on that. What I love about the fact that I have an MFA instead of an MBA is I get to laugh at the little isms that come out of business school, but one of the ones I love, sunk costs, are just that. We need to rethink what success is. One of the things that professors get to do, they get to talk a lot more than people like Susan and I because we're always in airplanes. But they get to come up with these really, really simple ideas after 25 years worth of work. And Dutch Leonard and Mark Moore at Harvard at the Kennedy School have come up with this notion called the strategic triangle. It's so simple. If you don't take anything else away from this conference, draw this picture. Actually, you don't have to. You all have it on the Xerox. They say that high-performing not-for-profits and NGOs succeed when a place where what you do has value aligns with people or organizations who are willing to support it, and you have the capacity to deliver. That, they say, is success. Well, I got to tell you what, I don't know about you, but I've been in board meetings, board retreats for days, months, sometimes years, where we talk about what is success. I've finally come in to bring a napkin, draw this on a napkin, pin it on the wall, and say, can we adjourn the meeting? Because that's all it's about. It's no harder than that at the basic level. And that's what I think we have to get used to. The third thing that we heard is that we have to renegotiate our fundamental relationships. Jesse talked about the importance of our partners in the world of collective bargaining. Is that what we call it? Maybe we ought to call it collaborative bargaining. Maybe that would be a different, better strategy. But we also have to renegotiate our relationships with funders, with community leaders, and with audiences. We have to understand their terms, not so much our terms. The fourth thing that we heard from leaders in Columbus is there's something wrong with the business model. It's fun when you prepare for one of these because Jesse, Susan, and I coordinated, and her talk was beyond break even, right? Ours is beyond sustainability. Well, I'll tell you what, the business model is bust. This is why it's bust. We start with a mission idea. We create a bunch of capital every year. We get some contributed money. We get some earned money. We maybe have some ancillary revenue. Maybe we're in the food and beverage business. Maybe we have an amphitheater someplace. Maybe we own some real estate, right? And we take all that capital and we invest it in whatever we do. Production, presentation. Well, some really smarter people than me, Danny Newman, if you go back long enough ago, the Ford Foundation said, you know what, you shouldn't spend all your money on production and presentation. Spend some on marketing. It takes money to make money, right? They said spend some money on development. Invest in building relationships, and you'll have more capital that you can then spend on production and presentation, and at the end, you'll have mission value. And won't that be wonderful? And if you've done a really good job, you'll have a balanced budget. Well, it's time to throw that baby right out of here with the bathwater. We have to move, as Susan has suggested, to a world of operating surplus. And it's no harder, by the way, than budgeting to break even, right? Here's a for what it's worth freebie. If you want a 15% operating surplus on $1 million budget, take $150,000 and hide it in the drawer. I was a treasurer of a small theater company, and the artistic director and I used to sit down at budget time, and he'd say, well, I need $3 million to do this. And I said, okay, well, that means we need to have a $3.45 million operating budget. Oh, we can't get that. We can only get $3 million. Okay, well, then you can have a $2.55 million operating budget. This isn't hard, right? We just have to agree that that's the way it's going to be. See, it's better than exercise, isn't it? Without an operating surplus, and Susan really made this point very eloquently, how can we invest in what's next? Investing 18 months behind the curve? Oh my gosh, where did this device come from, right? If Steve Jobs and his team had waited for demand for this. Now what's really interesting, and we heard it yesterday in Larry's presentation, right? He was the one who said a mouse. Pretty cool things, Xerox. Xerox left a lot of things on the table, right? Digital Equipment Corporation, they actually left the PC on the table. We don't think anybody will ever want one of these, right? But if you're behind the curve, you can't do research and development, and you're never going to create any cash reserves. I don't know, endowments, really interesting thing. How many organizations in the room in 2008 or early 2009, your endowment was underwater? No, not as many as I expected. In other organizations, the percentage was so high that there were literally billions of dollars tied up in endowments that were inaccessible because the law says, if it's underwater, you can't spend it. So we have to rethink the whole business model piece. Fifth, Susan already gave you a great speech on this. If you're not adequately capitalized, you can't change. And I got to tell you what, this is a time of as fundamental a change as we can get to. So what did Columbus decide? Because they're not a community that's willing just sort of to wait and say, okay, pretty bleak. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? What Columbus says actually is, you know what? There's 15 other cities in the country that we're competing with for people to live here, to bring jobs here, to start businesses here, to have good lives here, and we want to win. So what do we have to do? First of all, they realized that sustainable wasn't good enough. This is another place where, how many funders in the room? So Susan and I can realize if we're never going to get any work anymore. One of the things that the intellectual community, that the funding community has pressed on us as a sector, and our short, the not-for-profit art sector is really only 45 years old, 50 years old. But one of the things they've told us in that time is institutionalize, be sustainable, create resources, professionalize. You'll be there forever. Well, in fact, sustainable turns out not to be enough. And one of the things that was real interesting in Columbus is we discovered, in fact, there's a bunch of points on a continuum to success. And it starts at, this is, don't tell them what you don't want them to hear part. There's actually a button below viable. It's called not viable. But we didn't, there wasn't a piece of clip art that had 4 dots on it. Anyway, Susan alluded to a lot of her midterm and long-term organizations. They live in a place that we would call viable, where they can pretty much function in the short term, maybe for 6 more days, if that's the cash that they have. But boy, they certainly can't grow and adapt. And this is the place that organization after organization after organization is trying to get to. They're not even here yet. Then there was this mythical land, the great green land of sustainability. It's a really wonderful world. Here, you know what? Guess what? We're not worried about next week. We can actually make payroll. And as an organization, we're delivering on mission. But you know what? The move after that, we don't have anything. The tank's empty. Whether it's resources to invest in physical plant, to invest in artistic development, to invest in staff development. When's the last time somebody in this room paid for a staff member to actually take a course? Right? Go into a corporation that's thriving. Ask them how much time and how much money they devote to the development of their human capital. We churn it through, as Susan said so well. You know what we do? We hire lots more really, really smart young people, and we use them up till they're done. So sustainability is an interesting place, but it's not enough. The place that we really need to get to, and this is at the heart of discussions, quite frankly, that are going on not just in our boardrooms, but in Washington, D.C., we need to get to a place where the organization is vital, and it has access to adequate resources that allow it not just to deliver on mission, but to reinvest in order to be able to adapt, to change, and quite frankly, most importantly, to deliver public value. Because if we can't make our communities better, and Jesse, I love it when the boss tickles the pink cow that's standing over there in the corner, excellence isn't good enough anymore. Everybody is excellent. You want to read interesting things, read Jeff Jarvis's What Would Google Do, which isn't about Google at all. It's about the world after Google, and excellence isn't enough. It's different in every community, and I won't take you into it in a lot of details, but when you score communities, when you look at measures like attendance and market, when you look at measures like contributed revenue and human capital, their asset base, their product, and by the way, not just now. That's another thing we do in our business, don't we, a lot, Susan? We look now. Where are we today? Where do we have to be tomorrow? But what's been the trajectory? How has it changed? What you discover is you can classify cities, and Columbus was pretty gutsy. I don't think my laser reaches over there. Columbus said, look at that. We fall in the bottom group here. Our sector is only viable. What do we need to do to move it to vital? They had a series of leadership conversations that took us to 5 things, and we may get you out of here close to on time. 1, we need to understand and align our arts and culture system with our community goals and civic priorities. If you're not with us, you're against us. That's a general, right? Eisenhower or somebody. If you're not with us, you're against us, and it needs not just to be in words, it needs to be in action. You need to show us how you're managing your organizations for impact. In Columbus, the most interesting question I heard was how was the arts and culture sector going to help the Blue Jackets, which I think is their hockey team, might be their soccer team, I think it's their hockey team, survive. Nobody's coming. They have the exact same problem that the Symphony, the Opera, and the ballet do. Aren't you all in the same boat? How are we going to change the community? By the way, we have a heads up, great work done by Urban Institute a long time ago now, late 1990s, that says, you know what? Vital communities have vital cultural sectors, and vital cultural sectors are really easily defined. There's presence of arts and culture opportunity. It's broad, it's diverse, it's robust, it's energized. There's participation in that by people who support it. Let's go back to the other really simple diagram. You can take this one home too, by the way, if you want to. And by the way, there are people who will either pay to attend or invest so others can. It's a really simple strategy for aligning your organization with community goals. The second thing that leadership in Columbus said is we need to diversify revenue, and we need to seek sustained philanthropic leadership. Jesse talked about the importance of term limits in terms of board governance. Now we're talking about in the foundation sector. We need to help the independent sector understand that a program every 3 years is not moving us forward. If we are medium view and long view organizations, we need to get to a place where we can actually make investment decisions that don't have returns next season, that organizational change won't be evident in next month's payroll. You can't do that without capital, and you can't do it without leadership. We've got to be pretty prepared to right size. Now, this happens to be one of the places where I think that the arts and culture sector has been a big winner and has been really successful. We have found efficiency in every rock that we could grind to dust. We employ fewer people than we used to. We ask them to do more jobs. We ask them to work longer hours. I have a bunch of students at the Yale Drama School who asked me to, one of their projects, they wanted to do a salary, a compensation salary, so they could know if they were going into the right field. I said, little late, you're already paying tuition, you might have done that before, but it's really, really important to understand the amount of capitalization that we've shifted the burden onto individuals. We can continue probably to find opportunities for some efficiencies in our system, but I go into every community, the free advice we give, we aren't going to save any more money at Organization X. Maybe somewhere. But most of the time, it's all been done. Couldn't figure quite how to word this. Had a long debate with Doug Kreidler, who's the president of the Columbus Foundation. Now, many of you may know him. He started in the music world. He ran Blossom not too long ago. Interesting arc there, employment trajectory. We do lots and lots of market research, right? It's been impressed upon the field. That's good to do. Mostly what we do is count, by the way. You know, we have 4 people, 2 green, 3 red, 1 orange. Oops, that's 6. We only had 4. That's just a little creative editorial privilege. Of course 6 people came. But we don't gain and use market knowledge. We actually don't internalize it. I can't tell you how frustrating it is for somebody like me to stand up in front of like a lot of people and say, here's some knowledge, use it. Doesn't do any good for any of us if we just compile it. You have to turn it into action. And so that's one of the key strategies that you'll see here in Columbus. And then finally, perhaps, it's a tough thing, but we have to accept the reality of the marketplace. Some organizations are going to go away. One of the characteristics of the vital communities that we looked at, one of which happens to be the Twin Cities, is that in fact, organizations have life cycles, and at the end, they go away because the need that they serve has either been fulfilled, which would be a great thing to say, or they were unable to fulfill it. If you look at the creation and failure rate of businesses in the corporate world, and you draw a little grid, right? There's lots and lots of startups, some mid-sized companies, and then some conglomerates. Some of them apparently too big to fail, but that's another discussion for wine and beer. But you look at the arts sector, we got lots and lots of little companies. We got an unbelievable number of mid-sized companies that can't make the transition to large companies. And we got a fair number of large companies that aren't failing and are in fact going backwards. So our system sort of folds in on itself rather than being a complete system. So Columbus, pleased to report, has taken some really positive action. The Columbus Foundation has joined with the Columbus Partnership, which is the corporate roundtable, and agreed on 4 actions. That the community will drive earned revenue. Hard to say this one, but a priority is going to be more butts in seats. Because guess what? I don't know. We had an interesting discussion. I can't remember whether it was Jesse or Polly or Susan about, is there enough? It was Susan about, Philadelphia, that's a rich place, right? Just come on, just reach into your pockets, Pew, solve the orchestra's problem. Susan says there's not enough money in the world, much less Philadelphia, to solve Philadelphia's problem. just like that. Well, if we don't drive more people into the business, into the doors, if more people don't buy our product, we're not going to solve the problem. We can't fundraise our way out of it. The community realized that they need a champion. Columbus is an interesting city. Many of you may know Ray Hanley for a long, long time, the head of their Arts Council, passed away. They went into this space where nobody was championing the arts. They couldn't get business leaders to go on boards. Philanthropists were getting bored and tired. So the corporate roundtable is saying one of our priorities is to empower a champion. The next thing is that they're going to have active conversations around what is health and what is responsible growth, because growth for growth's sake just doesn't work. In fact, if you look at the data, all the growth that's happened in Columbus, and I suspect many other communities, arts sector, has been just eaten up by inflation anyway. So we've been in the same place for a decade or 15 years. If we're not really growing, then we're not actually moving forward and changing, and we need to deal with that. And the community is going to set real goals for that growth. It wants 4 things to happen. It wants to see increased access, which may mean challenging fundamental assumptions about Thursday night, 7:30, be there or be square. It wants to increase opportunity for success by making strategic investments of significant capital in organizations that are prepared to engage in change, innovation, opportunity. It has a high focus on public value. If I were to reduce it and say, if I were an arts organization in Columbus and I were looking for some funding, what would I do? I would have one metric. One metric. This is the positive contribution that I make to the individual and collective lives of all Columbusians, whatever they would be. Now, actually, I stole that. The California Arts Council has a public value program, and it very simply states, if you're going to win in the 21st century, you need to be able to demonstrate that you are making a positive contribution to the community in which you are based. Sorry to all my friends here, that doesn't mean to the field in which you work. And it's one of the things that we have to figure out how to balance. Finally, I think we have to drop the sustainability word, because sustainability only means we can do what we were doing today. I think we need to really be aggressive. We really need to be honest. We really need to be proactive. And we need to talk about what it takes to get to vitality. And if we can't get there, we should really, really question why we even exist. With that, thank you very, very much.
Well, our great thanks to Steve and to Susan. I think they've given us quite a lot to think about. And now we have a chance to go into the delegate lounge and all have some coffee together. So we encourage you to go there and keep the conversation going. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Since Moscow burned.